Here we have the skeleton, pretty much, of what is the dreaded carbon cycle. Now, even at GCSE, a lot of students say to me that they don't really get the overall carbon cycle, or they have trouble remembering it, because there are so many different steps, they don't know where to start. This is a completely valid point, and what I want to tell you is that there is no correct way to start. You don't have to begin with CO2, you don't have to begin with plants, you don't have to begin with consumers, dead organisms or fossil fuels. The point is, this is a cycle. It says in the name carbon cycle. It means you can start from anywhere and you can get back to where you started. So obviously, regardless of how we think the Earth began and how we think life began, now we do have CO2 in the environment, we do have plants, animals, we do have fossil fuels, and we do have dead organisms and dead organic matter which can turn into fossil fuels. Therefore, feel free to think of any which one you like and think, how do we get from this to the next stage or to any other stage? And so I'm going to start off just at the bottom of the page, which is with these dead organisms. If you have a dead organism, what can happen to that dead organism? Can that dead organism become an animal? Well, no. Scientifically, no, it can't. Disregarding all of these theories of reincarnation and everything else, whether that's true or not, it has to become something else first. Their body will not just come back to life. That's not what happens. If you've got dead organisms and dead organic matter, that needs to get back into the air somehow. And the way that that can happen is, one, the dead organism can be buried and buried and buried in mostly sedimentary rocks. And so burial and sedimentation is going to lead you here. Because in sedimentary rocks, we can find our fossils and everything else, and we will eventually form what is a fossil fuel. And so we can form a fossil fuel, we can't form a consumer or an animal, and we can't form a plant. Can we form CO2? The answer is absolutely, because it's not a very nice image, but if you think about when you've seen a dead animal or, dead anything rotting, you get microorganisms on there feeding on it. You get things like maggots and other decomposers, which are actually breaking down that organism. They're feeding on the organism and breaking it down. When that organism is being broken down, the decomposer is actually respiring as well. And respiration, you'll know, gives off CO2. When we respire, we give off CO2, and it's the same for the decomposers. And so decomposers can turn dead organisms into carbon dioxide. I'm finally going to have a look at fossil fuels on this left-hand side, because can a fossil fuel be brought back to life immediately and become an animal? Well, no, it can't, and it can't become a plant either, because that just completely defies the laws of nature. Fossil fuels, can they become dead organisms? Well, no, because dead organisms form fossil fuels, not the other way around. But can a fossil fuel become CO2? Of course it can. That is the main problem with us burning petrols and burning other fuels, because combustion causes the release of CO2. So fossil fuels cause the release of CO2. And so let's fill in these stages. Well, dead organisms to fossil fuels, that was sedimentation. Sedimentation. Fossil fuels to CO2, well, that was burning of fuels known as combustion. And dead organisms forming CO2, well, that was decomposition and decay. So decomposition by the decomposers. And obviously the CO2 is released by respiration. Right, so now we're at CO2. Can an animal take in CO2 and form organic compounds using it? Well, no, it can't, because we can't photosynthesize. We can't take in CO2 and just turn it into glucose, because then we wouldn't need to eat. We could just breathe in all the time. And so that's not possible. But we do give off CO2 by respiration. So we are going to have an arrow going this way, and that is going to be your respiration. One very important thing which a lot of people will miss is, even though plants carry out photosynthesis, plants also carry out respiration. So plants will also give off CO2 by the same process. And so if we fill those in, both of those are going to be respiration, respiration. Okay, Of course, the obvious one with plants is plants can actually take in CO2, whereas we can't, and turn it into food, turn it into glucose. So that means the CO2 is going from here, from CO2 in the air, into the plants and becoming organic matter in the plants. And that is not via respiration, of course. That is via photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Bear in mind that this is a simplified diagram because obviously there are some algae and some bacteria that can do exactly the same thing. We haven't included them on this carbon cycle because otherwise that would get quite messy and complicated. Okay, so from our plants, can a plant turn into part of an animal? Well, that sounds a bit odd, but obviously it actually can, because we feed on plants, and because they photosynthesize and form these carbon compounds, we eat them, and therefore we take over their carbon compounds. We take their carbon compounds in, and then we use them to form proteins and fats and carbohydrates and everything else that we need. So yes, the carbon from plants, can go to consumers, and that is via feeding. So we feed on the plants and we take over their carbon. Plants, can they turn into dead organisms? Well, of course they can, because they're alive and eventually they are going to die. And the same can be said for animals. They're alive and eventually one day they are going to die as well. And so this process is known as death. And it's the same for plants and animals, and there we are. Now that was pretty simple. I didn't have to memorise where each arrow goes. All I had to do was think it through, even talk to yourself if you have to. It does help collect your thoughts, but you just think it through. How does the carbon from one step get to the next step? How can I go from a fossil fuel to carbon dioxide? Well, all you have to do is burn the fuel. How can I go from a consumer to carbon dioxide in the air? Well, they respire, which releases carbon dioxide, which does go into the air. So you can always work out where the arrows go, and you can work out which way the arrows are pointing, because CO2 can't go into a consumer and become part of the consumer, because we can't breathe in CO2 and store it as food, whereas plants can, and that's photosynthesis. Okay, so I hope that helped sort of collect everything and make it a bit more simple for you. Feel free to comment below or send me an email if you do have any more questions on that, and I'll see you in the next video.